Hello there, listeners. This is an audio recording of my book, The Westwind Tales of Sword and Sand, which is book 1 in the Westwind Tales series. If you like what you hear, consider subscribing, leaving a like or a comment, or preferably all of the above. If you want more content like this, consider supporting the channel by purchasing my book on Amazon, becoming a channel member by clicking the join button, or, preferably, both. So sit back, relax, grab a cup of tea, and enjoy the chapter. Chapter 1. Du Wos when du Hoth, the man with the silver hair. So, began in the month of falling leaves on a road near Rockford. The rusted trees had just begun to litter the earth with their leaves, and a warm, musty breeze rustled through the foliage over the cobbled pathway leading into the town. He stood in the shade under a pale white mountain oak, staring down the road. Though he couldn't quite make out the buildings through the trees from where he stood, he could hear a low rumble drifting about that hinted at the presence of man. He blinked his eyes against a gust of wind that tossed leaves in twisting patterns around his feet. Shaking himself, he breathed deeply. Turning his head, he gazed about him. Confused, he squinted, looking down at his upturned palms. He had forgotten. He noticed a silver ring on the middle finger of his right hand. It was battered and worn, and looked to be unbelievably old. Holding up his hand level with his eyes, he inspected the ring a little closer, bore markings on it that seemed neither to begin nor end at any specific point upon its surface. Dents and scratches mixed with the markings to such a degree that it was difficult to tell whether a particular mark was intended or accidental. He reached with his left hand toward his right hip and grasped for something. He could not remember what. He let both of his arms fall to his sides and looked about him for someone. He could not remember whom. With a huff of frustration, he set off toward the sounds of people down the road. The wind turned and blew with him down the winding path, grabbing at his shirt and tossing his long silver hair into his face. Behind him, perched in the upper branches of the mountain oak, a large, black-feathered owl stared after him, its amber eyes gleaming in the shadows of the leaves. Rockford was a small town on the banks of the Morgan Flow. Stone buildings with a mix of thatched and slated roofs were scattered seemingly at random along the road into the town center, becoming increasingly more orderly and aligned the further in one walked. At the center of the town there was a fountain filled with dirty water in which red and yellow leaves floated placidly. Folk meandered through the square, heading this way and that. A few looked up at the man as he walked, but most simply ignored him. Although the fountain had stopped working long ago, the townsfolk did not have the knowledge nor the wherewithal to fix it. They also did not care much whether the fountain was in working order or not. They, after all, were not the ones who had built it. The fountain was an immense circular structure with 2 tiers, each with weathered figures chiseled into the sides, depicting scenes from some long-forgotten story. At the top of the fountain, in the middle of a pool of stagnant water, there stood a statue of a cloaked figure with hood thrown back, revealing a head bowed with chin against chest. On the man's brow, and it was as noble a looking man as could have been carved, there wrapped a circlet of rusted iron, and clutched in his hands, tipped to the earth, was a sword. In contrast to the rest of the decoration on the fountain, the statue stood as lifelike as the day it was first carved. The man's hair was pulled back and held in place by a carved ring patterned with ancient runes. His eyes and mouth both closed, his hands clenched upon the handle of the sword. The statue appeared as though it would at any moment raise its head to glance at a passerby. It was at the base of this statue that the man found himself, looking up at a face locked in stone. Something about this place felt right, as though it were where he needed to be. He ran a hand along the edge of the fountain and felt the weathered stone beneath his fingers. The rough edges, where the stone had chipped away, were a lighter shade of blue-gray stone than the rest of the base. The water was undisturbed, but murky and black, as though the second rested upon a mirror. Autumn leaves floated in the water, like ships at sea on a moonless night. The sun hung high above the rooftops as the man walked in a full circle around the fountain, tracing the edge with his hand along the way. He stopped and gazed around the town as he brushed a strand of silver hair from his face, pulling it behind his ear. He shoved both hands into the large side pockets of his trousers and ambled over to the inn nearest the statue. Outside the building was a sign hanging over the doorframe. On it, the words, "The Knight's Head," were painted in gold, along with an attempted likeness of the statue's face. He opened the door and quietly stepped in, blinking as his eyes adjusted to the low light of the inn's common room. Dust hovered lazily in the beams of light shining through the dirty windows, and the hearth fire gave the room a warm, welcoming feel. Several tables were scattered in the corners of the common room. One long table stretched before the hearth. A high counter, behind which the innkeeper normally stood, blocked off part of the room to his left. As he moved further in, a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out of a back room through a door behind the counter. He was wiping his hands with a stained rag and apparently hadn't noticed the man come inside. He was well built and bald as an egg. His face was creased with lines around his mouth and eyes, and in his thick, red mustache were flecks of gray. He wore a brown apron over a white shirt and green trousers. The elbows of his shirt were patched, though not shabbily, and his apron was covered with flour. The thick smell of baking bread wafted out of the back room. The innkeeper looked up and flinched when he noticed the man standing near the doorway. "Oh!" He placed a hand on the countertop and let out a breath. "You nearly gave my heart a turn there, man. You shouldn't be sneaking into places like that. You could scare a man to his death, you could." The man at the door fidgeted, not knowing how to answer. The innkeeper continued. "Make some noise next time, man." His eyes flicked up to the man's silver hair. "You don't look familiar. You aren't from Rockford that I know, just from looking at you. What's your name?" The innkeeper stood at the counter, gazing intently at the man with the silver hair, who stood silently, unable to answer. What was his name? He searched his memory, growing all the more frantic the longer he thought. He did not know his own name. He opened his mouth to speak, but still no memory of his name stirred within his mind. The innkeeper tapped a finger on the counter, not sure whether to speak or to give the stranger more time. Sheepishly closing his mouth, the man moved to scratch the back of his head with his right hand as he looked at the innkeeper. The innkeeper's eyes caught the flash of his ring. His expression changed to that of surprise. "Kell," he stuttered. "Pardon me for asking you questions. I know you take oaths of silence and all." The innkeeper bobbed his head in apology. "My name's Brandon. I own this inn. You're welcome to stay the night if you'd like." Brandon took a step backward and brought up his hands, palms outward. "Free of charge, of course. I can see you've been traveling by the looks of your clothes." Brandon smiled when the man nodded his head in acceptance and gestured with his arm toward a staircase on the other side of the room, near the fireplace. "The room is just up there, Master Kell. Second floor, 2 doors down." He reached behind the counter and retrieved a metal key with a green ribbon tied to the end. "Here is the key, sir. I won't ask you questions. Make yourself comfortable, and if you feel up to it, come down later on and I'll fix you something to eat." Brandon stammered and reached partway toward the man. "That is, only if you feel like it. I don't mean to be telling you what to do and all. Please make yourself comfortable. It's a good room, just cleaned it. Fresh seats, new candles." Brandon's cheeks turned pink as he trailed off and let his gaze fall to the floor, embarrassed. "Stay as long as you wish, Master Kell. You're welcome as long as you need the room." He shuffled awkwardly into the back room behind the counter, casting a furtive glance over his shoulder as he went. Kell watched him go. He held the key in his hand and breathed a sigh of relief. That was fortunate, but strange. He moved toward the stairs and up to the second floor. 2 doors down, there were rooms on both sides of the hallway, and Brandon had neglected to tell him which side. Kell smiled. He really unnerved the poor man. He tried the key in both doors and found that it opened the one on the right. As he pushed the door in and entered the room, light poured in from the hallway. True enough, the room was exceptionally clean. There was no dust on the lone desk at the wall, and the bed was freshly made. Small particles of dust hung suspended in the shafts of light shining in through the window in the far wall. There was a chest at the end of the bed, but Kell figured that he wouldn't need it. All he had were the clothes on his back and the ring on his finger. He turned to the desk and saw that there was a looking glass mounted on the hardwood paneling above it. He stared at his reflection as though he were seeing a stranger. No part of his face sparked any recognition in his mind. He was seeing himself for the first time. Silver hair hung down around his shoulders. A few days' worth of shadow clung to his jaw and lip, and piercing silver eyes stared back at him from the surface of the mirror. His cheeks were shallow and pulled taut over the accented bones of his face. A sharp nose with a slight bump in the middle protruded over his lips and sat between his eyes. Kel drew his fingers across the lines of his face, inspecting every aspect of the unfamiliar terrain. He looked young, not over 25. His skin had a slight olive tint that gave him a weathered appearance. His mouth was arched and pink, except for the white scar running down the middle of his lower lip. Kel smirked at the face in the mirror, trying to remember anything at all, but ended up shuddering as the stranger grinned back. Pulling out the stool under the desk, he sat down, the weight of his situation beginning to press upon his mind. He was a stranger to everyone in the town and to himself. Apart from the ring on his finger, he had no possessions that he knew of. He had no home, no friends, no family, and nowhere to go. Kel leaned forward and placed his elbows on the desk, propping up his head with his hands. The innkeeper had called him a Kel, whatever that was, offered him a room for free, and seemed genuinely taken aback when he had noticed the ring. He let out a breath and covered his face in his hands. What was he going to do? He sat there for a moment, contemplating his options. I can stay in the town, he said aloud to himself, or I can leave and try to find out who I am. Kel stood up and walked over to the window and peered out. The view overlooked the town square below, in which the fountain stood. The ground was a mosaic of red and auburn brickwork, with small grasses and weeds sprouting randomly from the lines between each block. From this vantage point, Kel could make out the oddities in the nearby buildings, namely that those nearest the square were built from the same color stone as the fountain, intermixed with red brick like that of the roadway and square. It gave the impression that each building had long ago been razed and then recently rebuilt, with a mix of the original stone that was still left and the red bricks that dominated the town's building materials. It dawned on him that while these buildings may be relatively new to the area, the town itself had likely sat on the banks of the Morgan since ancient times. He propped himself up on the windowsill and leaned over his hands as he gazed out over the square. The smell of the cedar trim around the window pulled his thoughts back to his dilemma. What if the answers I seek are here? He tapped a finger on the windowsill. I have nothing. If I leave town now, I might as well as not be running toward disaster. I have no map, no idea where I am, and no idea where to go. That settled it. Leaving at this point would be a mistake. Kel made up his mind. He would stay in town and look for answers. He ran his fingers through his hair and straightened his shirt before heading toward the door. Taking the stairs down into the common room, Kel heard voices drifting up the staircase. A real Kel, I'm telling you. He's upstairs right now. Well, that wraps up part 1. Make sure you tune in for part 2 later this week. And in the meantime, leave a comment and a like. If you can't wait for part 2, then you can head on over to Amazon and purchase the full-length book there. Or you can click on the link down below. I'll see you all next time, but until then, enjoy the adventure.